Vi befinner oss på Engelsbergs bruk i Bergslagen där 2023 års Engelsbergsseminarium äger rum. Temat för i år är Leadership and Statecraft. I det pass som vi nu ska få ta del av diskuteras några särskilt heta och brännande frågor. Från konfliktområden i öster till frågan om kärnvapnens ökande betydelse.
In this changing world, two new nations have been drawn into the great game around the Pacific, Australia and Japan, and we'll take a closer look at their policies, first with Rory Medcalf with the Australian perspective.
Well, thank you. I suspect I've probably travelled the longest distance of any delegate here today, but fascinatingly, when you start to look at the strategic challenges being faced by my country, by Australia, in the Indo-Pacific, and you take a look at the context and the strategic disruption here in Europe, there are all sorts of resonances, and I want to explore some of those today. So please just begin. I have no slides, so please just begin by imagining the world map upside down, as it should be, with Australia and New Zealand near the top, and just start thinking a little bit about how the security environment is seen by a country like Australia. I'm going to talk about two things in the next few minutes. I'm going to talk about the contest for dominance, really, and influence in the Indo-Pacific region. But I'm also then going to talk a little bit about the Australian way of responding to that. And a big part of that story is the AUKUS technology sharing arrangement, which we all know about, but I think few of us really understand. And so I want to dwell on that a little bit and then come back at the end to questions about, actually about deterrence, really, and how do we achieve deterrence in the Indo-Pacific without destabilisation, deterrence without escalation. So to begin with, just a few framing thoughts about my region, about the Indo-Pacific, which is now a concept and a term that's become quite orthodox in understanding international affairs, but until a few years ago it was really something of an academic curiosity. We were talking about Asia or the Asia-Pacific. I know I've probably got a few British colleagues in the room who still use the term Far East. Please don't do that. It's the Indo-Pacific, and it's quite a serious point because if you start reframing the Asia-centric maritime region as the Indo-Pacific, you start looking at its global connectivity. You start looking at a part of the world that is the centre of gravity in terms of economic growth and dynamism, certainly central in terms of demographics, at least until perhaps in the second half of the century we see Africa take its place ahead of Asia. But the Indo-Pacific is also, of course, a place of great strategic rivalry and pressure, and much of that is really centred on the way that China has used its rising power and the unsettling effects that's had on the interests, the stability and the values of others in the region. And there is, of course, a thread that connects that very clearly to the shock and disruption that we've witnessed here in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because the No Limits partnership between the leadership of Russia and China as of just the eve of the invasion of Ukraine confirmed, I think, for many of us that there really is one evolving strategic theatre of contest. But a few more thoughts about the challenge we face in the Indo-Pacific. I think a lot of the popular narrative about the security tensions in my region really go back to the relationship between the United States and China, and a popular narrative is to say this is all about the United States seeking to retain primacy in a region where it's had strategic primacy for decades, and a rising power, China, seeking to displace the United States, as if that's the natural order of things, that the rising power displaces a declining power. And that narrative completely excludes the interests and the agency of actually most of the region, because Asia is much bigger than China, and the Indo-Pacific, although it's an Asia-centric region, actually engages global stakeholders. So Europe, for example, has very serious economic stakes and indeed normative stakes in the outcomes of what happens in the Indo-Pacific. So if you put aside for a moment the theory that this is all about US-China rivalry and it's actually about something else, then you look a little bit more at China itself and what China is seeking to achieve in the Indo-Pacific region. So think of a region that really spans the two oceans, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, that is defined by the growing connectivity between those regions, the flows of trade, of energy, of people, of information, of finance, of investment, that reflects in many ways China's own expanding interests. You know, the so-called Maritime Silk Road, part of the Belt and Road, is really in many ways China's version of the Indo-Pacific, extending influence through geoeconomic connections all the way to Africa and beyond. And if you look at the region in that way, then in fact there are many players at work. You know, India, a rising power, Japan, and we'll hear more about that shortly, a very substantial and significant power, a democracy in the Indo-Pacific that in many ways is becoming a more effective strategic actor and using the idea of the Indo-Pacific to build coalitions to protect its interests and to limit Chinese power. The Republic of Korea, the new Korean administration, I think is being much more outward-looking in building its security partnerships as a democracy. Southeast Asian countries, and I think Philippines, for example, re-engaging closely with the United States at the moment. And then, of course, the question of Taiwan, and Taiwan is actually one of the most sophisticated democracies in the Indo-Pacific and a vital part of the regional and indeed global economic order. So in this mental map, what's Australia doing and why is Australia seeking to really strengthen its own security capabilities? If we look at an Indo-Pacific region where China is pursuing some form of dominance, and I think there's plenty of debate as to whether there's some sort of plan or vision to be the dominant power in the region or whether this is really an extension of the authoritarian control and the need to assert Chinese power and Chinese nationalism to cement that control domestically. In some ways, it almost doesn't matter whether there is a plan, because in my view, what we're seeing from China in the Indo-Pacific is a kind of colonialism on speed, if you like. In many ways, the flag's following trade. There is understandable economic and diaspora connections across the region. That's fine, but there's also a security footprint that's following that. We're seeing that in Australia's neighbourhood in the South Pacific at the moment. And the effects are effectively the same. The effects are destabilising, unsettling for the interests and values of many other societies and countries. And this does lead to frictions, it does lead to disruption, it does lead to flashpoints, to risks of conflict. And so although I suspect when we get to a conversation, the future of Taiwan is front of mind when we're looking at flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific, and there are plenty of understandable questions and much scrutiny about whether the invasion of Ukraine is going to hasten or delay the day that the leadership of China decides to take reckless action against Taiwan. Taiwan is not the only place of friction in the Indo-Pacific. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, the China-India relationship, and that broader horizon of risk where China's interests are expanding and a security footprint is following the economic footprint. All of this creates the potential for confrontation between powerful states, which is why, incidentally, the Biden administration's policy of competitive coexistence is actually a sensible setting and probably about the best that we can hope for to achieve deterrence without destabilisation in the Indo-Pacific. So what's Australia doing? The conversations I've had here already, just in one evening here in Sweden, and earlier this week I was in Finland engaging with the think tank and official community there, are really illuminating for me, because there's a fascinating parallel between Australia's decision to pursue a nuclear-powered submarine capability under the AUKUS agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom, and the pursuit of NATO membership by Sweden and Finland. both challenge fundamental assumptions about strategic alignment that we've assumed for many years, or assumptions about the public and political appetite for change and really a hardening in security posture. Because in Australia's case, a country which has traditionally been very allergic politically to all things nuclear, and where in many ways we have developed military capabilities and security capabilities that are not commensurate with our extraordinarily large geography, this is really a sea change. The pursuit of a nuclear-powered submarine capability would give Australia the ability to deter and monitor across a much larger maritime space in line with Australia's extraordinary Indo-Pacific geography. And it reflects an Australian commitment as well to collective security in the region. So in fact, one of the great diplomatic challenges that my colleagues in the Australian government, the Foreign Ministry, are pursuing now is to ensure that the region and regional partners understand that a stronger Australia is actually in their interests as well. And there's a very substantial Chinese disinformation campaign to undermine that view. But the pursuit of that technology sharing arrangement with Britain and America is not the only thing Australia's doing. And I should note, of course, that AUKUS is not only about submarines, it's also about really trust and sharing in critical security technologies in a way that can in time be extended to additional partners, including here in Europe, based on capability, trust and wider engagement. But the Australian reality check on security goes much broader than the military dimension. The contest for influence in our region is a military contest, reflected particularly in China's military modernisation and the expansion of its navy, of its blue water power projection capability. But there's also a contest for influence through geoeconomics, through investment and infrastructure and trade and development in ways where China is seeking to gain strategic advantage and in some ways, in some cases, capture of local elites as well. For Australia, one of the big wake-ups actually was clearly reported campaigns of political influence and indeed interference around 2016, 2017, and a very strong national response to that through legislation to restrict foreign political interference, which of course didn't particularly make Beijing happy. The momentous decision from Australia to exclude non-trusted vendors from 5G networks, Huawei and ZTE, was another big step in that journey to really hardening the national security infrastructure of Australia, but doing it in ways that reflected the will and the culture of a democratic society. What we've seen recently is an adjustment to that view, and I think when we get to a conversation about stabilisation, about how to ensure deterrence without disruption or destabilisation, the Australian experience is quite instructive, because what we now have in Australia, a relatively new Labor government in the past 12 months, its rhetoric is softer, it's more disciplined, if you like, with regard to China. It's trying to, if you like, stabilise that bilateral relationship. But the national security settings have not changed. And the very fact that under a Labor government in Australia, there is continuity in the AUKUS nuclear submarine program is really an extraordinary thing. It builds largely a consensus. I mean, there are some parts of the Australian political debate that will still challenge this, but at least at a leadership level, there is largely a consensus across the spectrum on this. And you have, in many ways, to use the famous, the famous metaphor, a country that is speaking softly but building, if not yet carrying, a big stick, which is a pretty nice definition of diplomacy. So where do we go from here? As I said, I think there is a full spectrum contest for influence in the Indo-Pacific. It is very much about an authoritarian Chinese state that, as yet, has not tested really the limits of its power in the region, is using risk as a form of leverage, so risk in the way that its maritime forces behave in contested zones like the South China Sea. but at the same time, an increasing amount of solidarity and pushback from a wider range of partners. And the very fact that we've seen European policy settings on China change in recent years towards that de-risking ethos, I think, is a really welcome development there. We will face flashpoints and risk in the Indo-Pacific for many years to come. So for those of you who are perhaps more from the private sector than from the academic or policy communities, I think thinking about the Indo-Pacific in terms of risk and thinking about China in terms of risk is not only a healthy starting point, it's the only starting point. And that's, of course, quite a change from the world of 5, 10, 15 years ago. The connection between the Indo-Pacific and the European theatres is going to remain, and if anything, I think as we see European partners become more interested and invested in stability in the Indo-Pacific, there'll also be a greater expectation of countries like Australia, Japan and others to really play their part in supporting stability, sovereignty, frankly, a rules-based order in this region. And so on that note, it's going to be fascinating to watch shortly when I anticipate the Australian Prime Minister will be at the Vilnius NATO summit, and let's hope there is some substantial new Australian commitments there to the defence of Ukraine. I'll stop on that note and I look forward to the conversation.
Yep.
Thanks.
Rory, did you drop something on the floor?
Yes.
Yes. What can be said about the bilateral relations between China and Australia? Have they been affected by the establishment of AUKUS?
So there's been a very difficult bilateral relationship between Australia and China for many years now. It really goes back, I'd say, to around 2017 when Australia began to introduce protective measures against Chinese influence in Australia. So in that sense, AUKUS hasn't fundamentally changed the relationship. It has added to what was already a difficult relationship. Having said that, the real low point, if you like, in Australia-China relations was when the Chinese government chose to take extraordinary offence several years ago when an Australian government had the temerity to suggest that there should be an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic. And the way that was handled diplomatically by Australia was somewhat awkward, but China's extreme overreaction to that decision, which involved effectively trade sanctions against Australia, that really was the low point in the relationship, a sort of a suspension of dialogue. So fascinatingly, although AUKUS is well and truly underway now, the Chinese government has chosen to look for, if you like, face-saving ways to maintain or rebuild some dialogue in the relationship, and that's in Australia's interest too. So although China is waging a very strong disinformation campaign against AUKUS in the region, in fact, bilateral dialogue is beginning to come back to some kind of predictable, stable footing, and that, to my mind, is a signal that it's pretty good to stick to your guns, so to speak. Yep. If you're standing up for your national interests, sooner or later, even great powers have to talk to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
A very warm welcome to Kentaro Fujimoto. We're very happy to have you here to give us the Japanese perspective on what's going on.
Today I'm going to talk about the changes that are occurring to Japanese foreign and national security policy. Before that, let me say that all the presentations and discussions are very inspiring to me and very relevant to what I'm speaking today. Let me say one thing. I happened to notice by hearing some of the presentations that we do not have a good translation, a good word for translation for the word statecraft in Japanese. Especially post-war Japan does not have such a vocabulary. So I came up with one good candidate word for translation, but it requires knowledge of Chinese classics. You know that Japan borrowed a lot of elements from the ancient Chinese civilizations, including Chinese characters. It's kind of a deep literacy that was mentioned at the very, very beginning of this seminar. So this fact tells me something. You know, I'm going to speak about the changes in the Japanese security policy, but it means that Japan is now facing a kind of facing the role of state that post-war Japan did not have to think seriously about. So let me start my presentation. Since the establishment of the Abe government in 2012, Japan has been undergoing quiet but significant changes in its foreign and security policy. This trend has intensified in the current Kishida government. This was triggered by a deterioration of the security environment around Japan, and the continuous trend is, of course, the rise of China and recently Russia's aggression against Ukraine. These have dramatically changed the Japanese perception of international relations, and the Japanese people believe that Japan has moved from post-Cold War era to an era of more severe state-to-state competition. In this context, Japan has begun to respond to the changes in a very pragmatic manner while preserving its own identity of democracy and freedom. Especially this year, Japan is the chair country of G7, and we needed to handle many important foreign policy issues simultaneously, such as Ukraine and Indo-Pacific, including China, and the relationship with Global South. First, I would like to describe briefly what is happening in Japanese foreign and security policy. In the Abe government, the legal structure of the Japanese national security policy has drastically changed due to the interpretation of our constitution. We could not fight together with other countries when other countries were attacked. But new legislation passed, and now we are allowed to exercise the right of collective self-defense if the situation affects Japan's existential national security interests as well. This is a major breakthrough in the history of post-war Japan. And also, in the Abe government, decision was made to introduce so-called standoff missile capability. This is the origin of the counter-strike capability introduced the Kishida government last year. Previously, Japan did not have medium to long-range missiles over 300 kilometers or 500 kilometers. However, if you look around Japan, China, Russia, North Korea, and South Korea all possess long-range missiles, and Japanese archipelago is extended very long from north to south. And the distance from the northern end to the southern end is about 3,000 kilometers. And in particular, Japan is very vulnerable in its defense of the southwestern islands, which stretch 1,000 kilometers long. So Abe administration made a decision in 2018 to introduce Norwegian-made JSM missiles to be loaded in the F-35. So let me move on to the Kishida government. Kishida government has placed economic security as one of the key issues in its national security policy. So they passed, the government passed a legislation for increased self-reliance of Japan and to promote economic security, including supply chain resilience, protection of critical infrastructure sectors, and now discussions are underway how we can enhance our security clearances to facilitate cooperation with other countries. And about defense spending, previously, Japan's defense spending was about 1% of its GDP. In the National Security Strategy published December last year, we decided to reach 2% of GDP by fiscal year 2027 to strengthen the standoff missile capability, unmanned asset defense, and cross-area operation capability. And counter-strike, in the strategy, we decided to squarely recognize the possession of counter-strike capability, and we plan to introduce a Tomahawk missile from the United States and develop indigenous cruise missile. And Kishida government also changed its policy toward Russia. For Japan, a Russian invasion of Ukraine was the complete end of the post-Cold War world. Mr. Kishida himself said many times that it became clear that globalization and interdependence alone cannot guarantee peace and development in the international community. So Japan considered this war as a matter of its own security, mainly for two reasons. One is about the future of free and open international order based on the rule of law is at stake. And the second reason is more geopolitical. Because this war, unfortunately, this war happened at the very center of the Eurasian landmass. This inevitably affects the security of Japan. So we cannot separate two areas, two ends of the Eurasian continent. So Japan believed that if this unilateral change of the status quo by force is allowed, this would be followed in East Asia. So Japan decided to introduce severe sanctions against Russia. Japan is the only country, Asian country, in the G7, and Japan's participation in the measures against Russia, I believe, has changed the nature of the fight against Russia from the transatlantic one to one of a global character. In this sense, I think it was a consequential decision for the international community too. And as a result of this, the relationship between Japan and Europe became even closer. Let me touch upon China. And our national security strategy sets China as an unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge in ensuring peace and security of Japan and the international community. This includes China's national goal of the great restoration of Chinese nation, broad rapid buildup of its military power, including nuclear capability, and recently strengthened cooperation with Russia. While adhering to the policy of peaceful unification with Taiwan, China has not ruled out the possibility of using military force. So Prime Minister Kishida said that mid to long-term goal of our policy towards China as follows. We need China to make a strategic decision that it will abide by established international rules and that it cannot and will not change the international order in ways that are contrary to these rules, and efforts to do so will be long-lasting, unquote. In other words, he made it clear that it is China that need to make the strategic decision. What can we do to bring China to a strategic decision of coexistence with the international community? I must say that there is no sure path forward. As Professor Zeliko said yesterday, the essence of statecraft is how. But in this case, how is a very difficult question because we are dealing with very, very big revisionist power. So maybe an important thing is kind of sense of timeline. So, and as an intermediate goal, Japan sets a goal of constructive and stable relations with China. Japan will express its concerns directly to China and strongly urge it to make responsible behaviors while seeking to cooperate where possible on common issues. But to manage the relationship in a constructive and stable manner, two things are important, I think. First, it is not good for us to be weak and vulnerable. So our national security strategy contains a phrase, new equilibrium. This is an important concept, although it hasn't received much attention. What it meant was that we should restore the balance of power, enhance deterrence, and reduce the likelihood of war. It is for this reason that Japan has decided to radically strengthen its defense capabilities. At the same time, we will encourage serious dialogue with China. It is important to communicate concerns openly. This must be done at the highest possible levels. And the second one is the unity of the allies and like-minded countries. It's very important in conveying message to China. For Japan, the US-Japan alliance is vital, and cooperation with Europe is increasingly important. And single message on international peace and stability is necessary to show our seriousness and to avoid any misunderstanding and miscalculations. Those two things are serious, very concerning to me. Finally, let me briefly touch upon the element of international order. Japan advocates a vision of its free and open Indo-Pacific, so-called FOIP. The definition of FOIP is very simple: to enhance the connectivity of the Indo-Pacific region and nurture and enrich the region as a place that values freedom and the rule of law and free from force or coercion. And this vision has echoed in many countries, including Europe, United States, India, ASEAN too. And the March this year, Prime Minister Kishida developed his version of FOIP in response to the invasion of Ukraine. The background to this was that the divided response in the international community, especially in the United Nations, to Russian aggression against Ukraine, it came as a surprise to Japan, and to me personally too, that the response to such a clearly evil act was so divided. So the emphasis in the new FOIP is how to maintain peace, and the new FOIP reaffirms the kind of minimum basic principles that international community should uphold. These principles, which are written in the United Nations Charter, including the territorial integrity and refrain from using force, these should be observed in all parts of the world. And this was also discussed in the recent G7 meeting in Hiroshima. There was an interesting session called About Peace, and we invited, of course, G7 leaders and President of Brazil, Indian Prime Minister, and President Zelensky of Ukraine. And we talked about peace, and this is a kind of a contest of leaders, if not leadership. The leaders talked not only about Ukraine, but also about the importance of solving conflicts, violence, and geopolitical tensions in other parts of the world. As the chair, Prime Minister Kishida summarized the discussion as follows: 4 points. We need to preserve the principles of the United Nations, like including the respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. The second one is we support just and permanent peace in Ukraine. Not simply peace. It should be just and permanent peace. And the third point is we do not allow any unilateral attempt to change the status quo anywhere in the world. And last point is we need to protect free and open international order based on the rule of law. So let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to a panel discussion.
Thank you. Please come back, because your elegant presentations has provoked a few questions. Japan imposed sanctions on Russia. Has it also helped Ukraine with weapons or money to buy weapons?
Weapon is a big question. But we provide a lot of economic assistance to sustain Ukraine economy. Plus, recently, our Prime Minister visited Kyiv this March. It's kind of a secret visit. And on that occasion, we provided big amount of money to NATO for the procurement of non-lethal weapons by Ukraine.
Is NATO opening an office in Japan? Or is that a top secret thing that I'm revealing now?
It was already reported.
Yes.
So we are very happy to strengthen the cooperation with NATO in any way. And as Professor Medcalf mentioned, Japan is also invited to Lithuania next month. And last year, it was the first time for the Japanese Prime Minister to attend the NATO summit.
But there will be some kind of office, NATO representation in...
With or without office?
Pardon?
With or without office.
Okay.
Our cooperation will continue to be strong.
It's becoming closer. I mean,
yeah, I think so. For example, when we had a big earthquake in Turkey this year, we sent our military aircraft to Pakistan where NATO has a reserve of some emergency items, like tents. So our aircraft carried NATO items to Turkey. It's a kind of small cooperation between Japan and Turkey, but I hope that these cooperation will be kind of accumulating and creating a kind of bigger cooperation between two sides.
How would Japan respond to an increased pressure from China on Taiwan?
Our bottom line is that the peace across the Taiwan Strait is very important and should be, if differences should be solved through dialogue. This is a very, very basic position, and we are going to send this message to the Chinese, to China, and including the leader of China.
How come that G7 suddenly has become a kind of global actor?
Maybe it's all relative. Other international formula were not necessarily effective compared with G7. G7 is a group of like-minded countries which shares value. Value aspect in foreign policy is increasingly difficult recently, given the rise of Global South countries. But among G7 and among G7 plus like-minded countries like Sweden, well, Australia, is increasingly important so that we can effectively address the issues of international community like Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Kristin, VN Bruusgaard.
Bernard Brodie, who was one of the early strategists of the nuclear era, wrote in the 1950s, "Thus far, the key objective of military strategy has been to win wars. But from now on," and he's referring to the ascent of nuclear weapons, of course, "the key objective of military strategy must be to avert wars. There can be no other objective." This quote epitomizes what scholars would later call and term the nuclear revolution, that is, the transformational effect that nuclear weapons would have on international statecraft, making wars less, not more, likely. But this theory also always remained just that, a mere theory that could not necessarily explain the way that states armed with nuclear weapons would behave after they acquired them. And yet, the essence of this theory continues to influence and affect our views about nuclear weapons and how they affect international politics. Most people still ascribe the lack of great power war after the ascent of nuclear weapons to their mere presence. These days, however, the resurgence of great power confrontation and contemporary wars are producing new questions about the truism of this theory, about such promises of the peaceful impact of nuclear weapons. And there are three key issues that I will bring up today that suggest that nuclear weapons are becoming more important to international politics and that they may not necessarily bring more peace. The first issue that I want to bring up relates to whether nuclear weapons are producing the same effect on the behavior of different types of states. I would posit that there are key differences in how nuclear weapons affect the behavior of different states and their strategy. Of course, nuclear weapons are the ultimate security guarantee of all the states that acquire them, but those states also conceive of their deterrent effect in distinct ways that are affected by a number of different factors. Geography matters, other military capabilities matter, perceptions matter, traditions matter. Geography matters because the types of military threats that states face are contingent on their geographic and their strategic environment. A large landmass that's encircled by potential adversaries will entail different and perhaps graver and more immediate security threats than a state that's located in an insulated island far away from its adversaries. Conventional military capabilities matter because states think differently about the interaction and interrelationship between conventional military force and nuclear military force. Perceptions matter because states formulate policy based on their understanding and interpretation of their potential adversary. His capabilities may seem frightful, even if he himself believes that his benign intentions should be apparent to all. And tradition and culture matters because the existing nuclear weapon states, including Russia, the United States, and China, all have decades of experience and large bureaucracies devoted to formulating nuclear policy and to sustaining their nuclear enterprise. These complexes each have their own idiosyncrasies, they look different, and the strategic problems they believe they face look different, which in turn produces differentiated strategic solutions. And finally, at the end of the day, decisions with regard to nuclear weapons use, and you probably touched on this yesterday, are down to individuals with their own individual idiosyncrasies and preferences. This range of differences between nuclear-armed states mean that the prospect of conflict between them looks dire, as they may, in fact, be loath to understand the precise logic that underlies the behavior of their adversary. The second issue that I'd like to raise is that these differences mean that the current war in Ukraine produces different lessons for different nuclear-armed states and different actors. Russia, of course, a key protagonist of this war. Many fear that the lesson they are drawing in the nuclear domain from the Ukraine war is that aggression under the threat of potential nuclear escalation brings fewer risks. The world's largest nuclear weapons arsenal is, of course, a key reason why US forces, for example, are not currently deployed in a large scale in Kiev. And Russia's conventional military performance shows us that such an alternative reality or scenario, in that scenario, Russia would have been unlikely to consider invasion or to make any type of progress in terms of actually occupying Ukrainian territory. But Russia may also be drawing other types of lessons. It may have learned that nuclear threats and bluster can only bring them so far. Their repeated nuclear threats have failed to make an impression and to affect the Ukrainian will to fight and to defend their country. The Russian leadership may still be concerned about the military utility of nuclear weapons use and whether it would, in fact, outnumber the political consequences it would face as a result of using nuclear weapons. As of now, at least, the nuclear taboo holds even for Russia. Finally, Russia is gaining experience now with how its nuclear threats produce political and military effect in terms of how other states react. Russia is watching Western responses with great interest and taking notes. Russia conveys openly that in a war with NATO, this would look quite different. And it conveys openly that facing a conventionally superior force that threatens Russian territory and sovereignty, it would consider nuclear use in a different way from what it does in Ukraine. Some question the credibility and utility of nuclear use to pursue aggressive objectives in Ukraine. Fewer, I think, would question the credibility of threatening nuclear use to preserve state existence. The United States, other Western nuclear-armed states, and NATO as a collective are drawing other nuclear lessons from Ukraine. To them, this war demonstrates once and for all the nuclear addiction of an adversary like Russia, and how any potential conflict with Russia would be nuclear from or even before the very first day of conflict. Nuclear weapons would constantly and consistently affect the course of such a war. The likelihood of nuclear use for warfighting purposes in a war in Europe would increase dramatically. NATO is renewing its nuclear competency and trying to do so fast because of this challenge. And the security policy communities across the Atlantic are agreeing that nuclear weapons have to be part of the mix to execute effective deterrence of nuclear weapons use. Nuclear weapons will be a more important part of NATO's deterrent mix in the future. Debates on the need for nuclear weapons are also taking place in other theaters, including in the Indo-Pacific. As we just heard, Japanese security and defense policy is changing. South Korea has actively sought a more comprehensive conventional counterforce capability to influence North Korean nuclear calculations and has a debate on nuclear deterrence. Both countries, Japan and South Korea, retain a capability to potentially rapidly develop nuclear weapons should their faith in the US security guarantee recede. With regard to China, many fear that they are drawing similar lessons to Russia as a result of the Ukraine conflict. And the United States and other countries have been doing their best to convince China that aggression in Taiwan would not go unpunished. But Chinese geography and strategic culture also suggests that China has distinct ideas about the strategic utility of nuclear weapons. China is betting more on other types of military technologies for its ability to dominate escalation and exert pressure on a potential adversary. It does not have the same approach as Russia. At the same time, China is solidifying its nuclear deterrent, in part in a response to what it perceives as a potentially lower US threshold for nuclear weapons use. So again, these differences in approaches and lessons learned and potential misconceptions about what the other side is thinking and doing bode badly for how great power wars may play out. And it's also bad news for those who were hoping that nuclear weapons had played out their role as a tool of international statecraft. The third issue I want to raise relates to how these differentials affect Europe and Northern Europe in particular, where we are currently. A new security policy landscape is being shaped in Europe by the war in Ukraine, by the measures that NATO is taking to enhance its deterrence and defense, and by the expansion of NATO here in the north. This new pattern is a result of the current security challenges, but it will be a feature of our future for the decades to come. It will take a lot, I think, to convince European states at some point in the future that Russia is not a force or a threat to be reckoned with. And similarly, it will take a lot to convince a future Russia, even one led by a completely different regime, that the type of force NATO has now and is now generating across Europe and in its border region harbors no aggressive intentions vis-à-vis Russia. We are watching a new Iron Curtain dawn on Europe as a result of the dire situation we are currently in. But the question is if we are paying enough attention to how it can be changed and transformed into something more constructive in the future. The greater relevance of nuclear weapons to both Russia and NATO in the future will have direct implications in this corner of Europe. This is already the case, evidently. We live very close to a key area of Russia's strategic retaliatory capability based on the Kola Peninsula. And in any crisis or conflict with NATO, Russia would take significant measures to strengthen its ability to defend these areas with direct repercussions for the security of our countries. This is a reality that Norway has been living with since it became a member of NATO. It's a reality for Finland and for Sweden as well. And for decades, this proposition has posed strategic dilemmas in the Barents Sea, in the Norwegian seas, as well as with regard to Atlantic sea lines of communication. In a war, Russia and NATO interests will clash directly here in this region. And it's impossible to imagine a war between, or a conflict between NATO and Russia that does not have these direct ramifications in our part of Europe. An expanded NATO means that the strategic landscape in this part of Europe, a part of Europe that's traditionally been characterized by very low tension, This landscape is shifting. It will likely be a question of time before this will affect Russian force dispositions. If no conventional forces are available to Russia, nuclear forces are the backup that Russia resorts to, also for signaling purposes. This means that we should expect and predict that the peacetime situation in the years ahead will become more tense, and we should expect and plan for the fact that a crisis or a war will have a substantive nuclear component right on our doorstep, and with potential implications for how our countries could be targeted. The new European security landscape will be one of iron curtains and hotspots of tension. And Northern Europe is likely to be one of these hotspots. Navigating this landscape will require leadership, creativity, and a degree of pragmatism. And not least, it will require an ability to imagine a future European security order that takes account of the fact that a part of the European continent is Russia, and that Russia is likely to remain a different place than NATO Europe for some time to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
The other day, Putin said that he has now transferred nuclear weapons to Belarus. Is this to scare or to use?
My interpretation would be that this is primarily to scare. It's a measure taken for signaling purposes, not least with regard to Western states. And Russia's had a long-standing grievance with regard to NATO nuclear policy and how the United States has deployed its nuclear weapons on the territory of third countries. And in one way, one could read the Russian measures taken with regard to Belarus as a response to this long-standing grievance that Russia has had.
I brought up the question yesterday, is there a difference between tactical nuclear weapons and strategic ones? I put the question to you as well.
There are differences in the distances that nuclear weapons can travel, and there are differences with regard to the yields, that is the explosive power of nuclear weapons. And that's the reason why traditionally there has been this delineation between strategic weapons and sub-strategic weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. But at the end of the day, the key delineation is that between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. And I think that that delineation also has a certain impact on Russian deliberations and discussions. I don't think that that delineation is completely blurred, even in the Russian context, even if many portray it as such.
Who would be the worst new member in the global nuclear club? Good question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's easy to think along the lines of the most likely new members of the world's nuclear club, where a lot of people are preoccupied with the dynamic that an Iranian nuclear capability would produce in the Middle Eastern region, with all the potentially destabilizing effects that could have on politics in that region.
Thank you.